right, so welcome to the Early Music at Newcastle podcast series. I'm Dr. Larry Zazzo, Senior Lecturer and Head of Performance at Newcastle University. In addition to my musicological work centered on Handel's vocal music, I'm also working counter-tenor, very much still in the business and performing on stages across the world, again with a concentration on Baroque opera. I'm currently in Frankfurt, appearing as Bertarido, the deposed ruler of Milan, who's trying to reconnect with his lost family in Handel's 1725 masterpiece Rodelinda, in a revival of Claus Guth's much-acclaimed 2017 production, which has also been seen in Madrid, Barcelona, Lyon, and of course here in Frankfurt. Also involved in that production as a dramaturg, and we'll soon discuss what that means, that term, is our guest today, Konrad Kuhn. Konrad studied comparative literature and theater studies in Berlin. He's taught at the universities of Vienna and Frankfurt and has worked as an acting dramaturg first at the Burgtheater in Vienna, then the Munich State Theater at Gärtnerplatz and at the Zurich Opera House. He's further been a guest dramaturg at Theater an der Wien, the Vienna State Opera, the Opera Nationale de Paris, the Teatro Real in Madrid, the Berlin State Opera, the Salzburg Festival, the Bayreuth Festival, the Baden-Baden Easter Festival, and the Festival d'Automne, among others, in Paris, in Dusseldorf, Bologna, São Paulo, and Tallinn. He collaborates regularly with directors Claus Guth, Tobias Kratzer, and Robert Wilson. He has been a dramaturg at Frankfurt Opera since the 2015-16 season and has been involved in a number of new productions, including Stifelio, Marta, L'Africaine, Madama Butterfly, and Electra. He also oversees the Happy New Year's series. Konrad, welcome to our podcast.
I'm delighted to be with you, and thank you for this elaborate biography.
Well, thank you for agreeing to take part in this in our series. So, Konrad, many of our listeners who aren't really aware of or sure exactly what a dramaturg actually is, it's an important position, especially in German-speaking theaters, but inconsistently used in the English-speaking world, perhaps more often in spoken theater than in opera. Can you explain to our listeners what a dramaturg is and what that involves for you in your work here at Oper Frankfurt?
First of all, I'd like to thank you because your spelling is amazing. You left out the E in the end. In English, British English, usually it's dramaturg with an E in the end, and you put it the German way, dramaturg, without that E, and that makes a distinction. Because a dramaturg, of course, which is a French word originally, is someone who writes plays, a playwright. And that's, of course, also the origin of the Greek term that a dramaturg was someone who, on one hand, wrote theater plays, on the other hand, tried to figure out how they should be written. And that tradition was picked up in the 18th century in Germany by Gotthold Ephraim Lessing, who wrote tragedies and comedies, but who was also working as a consultant at the theater in Hamburg. And he put down his thoughts about what theater should be, what should be played, which pieces, and how they should be performed. And then what he did is very interesting. He gave his thoughts to the authorities of that theater who were running it, but he also published it in a newspaper. And he gave it the title, eine hamburgische Dramaturgie. So that's, let's say, the origin of the term in the German-speaking countries, which then spread over Europe and also in the United States is very current now. You even have a Lessing Award in the United States for dramaturgs. So it seems that in America, people are very aware of that tradition. And that was then, of course, continued by people like Bertolt Brecht or even Goethe, who was running a theater in Weimar, who was also writing plays and also meditating about what theater should be. So this is the tradition, of course. And you are perfectly right. It started in spoken theater, in dramatic theater. And personally, that was also my beginning. For the first 15 years or so, I was working exclusively in dramatic theater. And in this century, or let's say in the 20th century, so former century, it spread more and more into the musical theater as well. It is very often related to a repertoire system, because one important task of a dramaturg is always to make suggestions what should be put on stage. In the dramatic theater, of course, I was reading constantly new plays, and I was making suggestions to a general manager of the theater. Then the second important task is to collaborate with the production team. First of all, the stage director, of course, the scenographer, costume designer, and in the case of musical theater, of course, also the conductor or a composer in case it's a new opera. And the third field is then the contact towards the audience. So you're in charge of putting together the publications of the theater, a magazine, a program booklet. We are constantly writing texts also for websites, for social media, and so on. And we are holding introductory talks on matinees, things like that. So these are basically the three things that a dramaturg is in charge of. And as you can see already, Lessing was dividing his activities between the public and the theater people he was working with, which was not always pleasing the theater people.
I can imagine.
Of course, reading in the newspaper how they should do better was not always to their liking. And in a way, in German, you say zwischen zwei Stühlen, between two chairs. That's somehow still sort of a good job description.
Mm-hmm. Not necessarily an easy position. I find it myself as a working singer, as a performer, and as an academic. I sometimes find, if not between two seats, we sometimes say I put different hats on, and it's very difficult sometimes to wear the two hats. And it's interesting you say. I was wondering in what way maybe you could. You have any examples of some difficulty, because in a sense you can be thought of in an academic context as kind of the proxy for the academic side. Perhaps maybe you don't always think about that, but a mediator, as you said, between stage director, conductor, and designer. But this textual, cultural, historical analysis, the kind of research side of the creative practice. I wondered if you had any examples of something where you felt you were much of influence, or there was a bit of tension. Do you sense any resistance from those, as Lessing did, resistance from the creatives here in the Opera House? I certainly have experienced that. When I put on my academic hat, from my fellow performers, are you an academic or are you a singer? You have to choose, kind of thing. Do you have any examples of that? And one of those examples might very well be Rodelinda, which we'll turn to in a second.
Yeah, well, there are, of course, different stages in developing new production. And in the beginning, it's very important to come up with material about the work itself, about the time from where it originates, and the context. And then in many cases, also the history of performance. If it is a well-known piece, there is very often a long tradition, of course. And I have to study these things, and I'm grateful that nowadays there's really a great variety of scientific research in the field of opera. And then my task would be to channel all this information in a way so it can trigger creative processes. And of course, every stage director is different, but with Claus Guth, for example, who staged our Rodelinda, it's really from day one that this conversation starts, and we develop the concept together with the stage designer, usually the three of us. And there's long discussions at the beginning. What is the core of the work? What is it all about? What's interesting about it? What's singular? And how can we find a form for it? But then during the process of the rehearsals, of course, I try to step back a little bit, and I represent the spectator during this rehearsal process, let's say. So I try to forget everything I know about what our concept is supposed to be, and try to experience what I see on stage. And then I give a reaction to the stage designer, to the stage director mainly, and tell him how it reads. And sometimes he has something in his head, but I don't see it on stage. And then I would tell him. So in a way, I'm in a position that I don't have to develop things in the rehearsal process, but I can try to keep a more objective view on things, how they evolve, and give back a feedback.
And I suppose the extent to which you were listened to is very much dependent on the director and the relationship you have with him. Obviously, you have a good relationship with Claus Guth, and we've already started talking about Rodelinda. So let's turn specifically to Rodelinda, which we're now performing. You were obviously involved in this production, as you said, not just from the spring of 2017 or March, whenever we arrived in Madrid when I joined rehearsals, but probably at least a year earlier, if not, with the production team, with Claus, speaking about the concept, speaking with the design team about what this could be, this piece, and what it was trying to say. Of course, again, putting my scholarly hat back on and speaking for fellow Handelians, with whom I have, I suppose, sometimes a love-hate relationship. They tend to be a very conservative bunch. And of course, the modern concept of a stage director, much less a dramaturg or dramaturge, simply did not exist in Handel's time. We know from one 17th century anonymous source, there was someone called Il Corago who did fulfill some of these activities or these duties, but it was more a basic one that perhaps included prompting, negotiating entrances and exits, and might have been taken by either the choreographer or the dancing master, or in Handel's case, very possibly the chief poet or librettist of the Royal Academy, Nicola Haim, and then later Paolo Rolli, who adapted the libretto and is kind of the poet. And that's interesting, you talking about Lessing, and that this comes out of the writing activity, and the dramaturge developed out of the writing side, the textual side rather than the musical side. Claus Guth, one of the most celebrated stage directors in Europe or in the world. He's in the tradition of Deutsche Regietheater. Maybe he doesn't agree with all of them. He's very good with the one-on-one things. I loved working with him. Deutsche Regietheater is sometimes it's spoken of in bad odor, perhaps because it's a German term. Perhaps outside of Germany, there's a little bit of maybe anti-German sentiment about that. This is something that comes out of Germany that involves updating or modernizing or other ways changing the drama, sometimes even the musical text. And then, of course, this has its roots in post-war revivals of Wagner, perhaps with Wieland Wagner, etc. It's often reviled, as I said, particularly by some of my colleagues, Handel scholars, who insist that Baroque opera, in keeping with historically informed nature of the musical performance practice, and indeed we have that here, we have an incredible period instrument orchestra, instruments played by members of the ensemble here at 415 on period instruments with all of the performance practice musical elements, but that the scenic element should also be performed in a manner that Handel himself would have recognized, and that it's only in this way that we can fully appreciate his dramatic genius. Couple questions here. Do you agree? or not agree. I have a feeling you don't. And perhaps you can shed some light on the creative process with Claus Guth in conceiving this particular production of Rodelinda. And to what extent was there any historically informed or historically aware considerations given to the staging by Claus and or the team? Big question there.
Yeah,
the big
a lot of
introduction.
questions.
Feel free to answer as you like.
Yeah, there's an old joke that initially there was one of the singers, maybe in a minor role, who was sent down to the hall to watch how it all looked from there. And one day he never came back. That's how the stage director was born.
I like that. The myth of the origin of the stage director. Very good.
And you're right. People like Goethe, for example, he staged his own plays, of course. And if we go to the 19th century in opera, someone like Verdi was keen to oversee the production. He was kind of a stage director. Actually, Verdi, in the end of his life, when he was honored as the greatest musician of the 19th century, he said, no, that's not true. Call me the greatest man of theater of the 19th century, not a composer. So for him, theater was a whole. And I think that leads us on the right path, because what is written in this call is just an information that has to be brought to life. And the same way that we nowadays are keen to study period instruments, what did they sound like? We read the old texts about articulation and so on. We study what at the time was the concept of affecte. How do you say that in English?
The affects, yes, the doctrine of the affects.
Doctrine of the affects.
Yeah.
But then, of course, the other thing is that we are living today, and we can't know what Handel really thought. We can try to find out what might have been his intentions, but in my opinion, a masterpiece is a masterpiece because what was the initial intention of the one who created it has completely gone into it. And now it is there for us to deal with. And to bring it to life means that we can forget about the question, what might have been the intention of the creator. We have to find our own truth about this piece. What is it about and how can we relate to it? Because theater is not a museum. And therefore, to me, it might be interesting, for example, to study old engravings of reports of what opera looked like in London in 1725. But first of all, I think we cannot presume that we can really have an idea of that, because it wasn't videotaped by the time. So there is no reliable testimony. And then the second thing, of course, is that people in the beginning of the 18th century had a completely different background from nowadays. And so they didn't have to compete with video games or computer games or binge watching a series on TV. They didn't have Dolby surround cinemas and
absolutely,
and rock music shows with lighting sophisticated and powerful and everything. So, but that is what people nowadays bring to the theater as a background. And I think what a gesture on a stage might have been like in the early 18th century, today it wouldn't mean anything to the audience at all. So what we have to find is our own language that relates to the music, to the core of the piece. I think that's the task. And that doesn't have to mean necessarily that we have to find a modern outfit. So it can be very interesting to use period costumes, why not? But then we should know why. We should always know exactly what we're going to convey. What is really the I'm repeating myself, what's at the core of the opera. And so in Rodelinda, for example, there's several things that we thought were really striking about this opera. The first thing is that the main character is a lady. It's Rodelinda. Of course, it is the tenor role, is the counter-tenor, Vertarido, equally important. But the central figure, everyone else is revolving around, is Rodelinda. And she's an exciting character. She is in the weakest position, but then it turns out in many scenes that she's the strongest. And everyone else has to react to her because she's so intelligent, and at the same time, she's a great lover. She wants to stick to her love for Vertarido even when she thinks he is dead. And how can we bring this character to life? And then the second thing that is so striking about Rodelinda, of course, is the role of Flavio, who is the son of Rodelinda, who doesn't have a single note to sing, but who is very important for the story and who must have been present already in 1725 on the stage in London.
As a silent character.
A silent character. So we thought maybe it could be interesting to tell the whole story from his perspective. And that's how we found our way into the piece.
It's interesting you bring up Flavio because, this silent role he's mentioned in the libretto, he's clearly very important in many of the scenes. He's mentioned by many of the characters. Brilliantly played here in Frankfurt by this actor and dancer Irene Madrid. As you said, in a way, Flavio becomes, it's one of the most wonderful one of many wonderful things about Claus's production is that the opera somehow, we see everyone on stage through Flavio's eyes, and he becomes very much, in a sense, a proxy for the audience, I suppose. And we see all of this war trauma translated into a kind of cartoonish nightmare in which all of the adults he knows become monsters. All of the adults in his life kind of disappoint him.
But it comes from his drawings, because our idea was that this poor kid is experiencing so many horrible things. He tries to come to terms with it using a pencil and making drawings. And these drawings then come alive. And so all of a sudden, we get the idea of these figures appearing around Flavio, who are actually derived from the drawings that he makes. And what we then did, maybe an interesting detail, we asked a real child, a girl of, I think, 11 years old, to make these drawings for us.
That I did not know. Wonderful.
So it is really the language of a kid that then translates, of course, into video projections and the mask figures. But the origin is the fantasy of a child.
No, I mean, to talk about, of course, this is a kind of artistic license. This is might be something that a more conservative audience member would object to. But in another sense, it's wonderfully, for me, in harmony with an aspect of Baroque practice, which is sometimes forgotten in many authentic productions, low-cost period productions, and that's the importance of these supernumeraries, the attendants, the non-speaking, the acting roles in an opera. We know from, for example, Radamisto, from one of a prompt book, a libretto with these notated prompts, that there were at least 26 extras on stage. And it's something you almost never see, of course, because of the cost. And some of them had quite important roles. Even in solo arias, you might still have a lady in waiting kind of attending on Rodelinda as she sings Ritorno Cara, which completely changes the dynamic. But in that sense, these extras on stage are also, I think, can, for the audience, also serve as proxies reacting, much like a Greek chorus would react to what's going on stage, not telling the audience how to think, but kind of mirroring the audience on stage. Another thing I thought was I guess, of course, Klaus and the team from the very beginning knew they were kind of designing this for maybe Frankfurt, or they knew they were going to have this Drehbühne. To what extent the revolve of the stage, for our listeners to know, the main principal set is a large house, a kind of a Georgian house, right? It's very 18th century. Incredible design.
Yeah, it's a house that Handel might have been living in.
That he might very well have been living in. And it has various rooms and staircases. And as this house revolves, it can become a haunted house in this kind of lunar landscape. And as the opera progresses, the characters walk through various rooms as the stage revolves. And the house kind of becomes a character, but the revolve, also probably a post-war invention, I think. Probably. Yes. Maybe it was late 19th century.
In the 20s already they had
it was in the 20s.
Yes. Piscator in Germany was the guy who invented things like that.
So a 20th century invention that in some way also fulfills the function of Baroque, rapidly changing when you had these flats and you had these 5-second changes that you can still see in Drottningholm. Yeah. From one scene to the other, you have big changes of scene, and it can happen in the ritornello or the introduction of an aria, and the revolve functions. So we have these kind of modern analogs, I think, to Baroque practices. I suppose, going back to you and Klaus, was this in their mind, or are these accidental correspondences that I'm finding?
Well, in this case, I think for us the main problem was, the story supposedly is about 8th century Milan, Longobardi.
Right.
That's nothing we can relate to. We know very little about it, and we certainly cannot imagine what it really means to be a king in the 8th century. But the struggle for power is something, of course, that is nowadays you can see everywhere. And so we were thinking, what's the symbol for the struggle for power? How do we translate kingdom? And there's contemporary productions where then Bertarido is part of a mafia clan and Grimoaldo of a rivaling clan. You have gangsters, or you pictures, I don't know, a modern dictator or something. And we thought that's not interesting. But what is interesting is that everyone wants to rule in Milan, and at the same time, they want to be in the bedroom of this woman, Rodelinda. And so that's how the idea of the house came up. So it's the symbol for the place where everyone wants to be. And at the same time, it used to be the home of Flavio. And all of a sudden, there are all these intruders. And how will he manage with it? How can he cope with it? So that was the original idea of the house. And then, of course, the revolve gives us the possibility, first of all, to picture different rooms in that house. And in a way, what the revolve does is a cinematographic means. So you can change during scenes, like the camera is moving. It works very much like a camera. So just that it's not the camera that is moving, it's the set that is moving. And of course, for Baroque opera, it gives us a great opportunity, because the biggest challenge is maybe to cope with the da capo form. And so what we are doing many times during that evening is that we establish the situation in the A part, and then the revolve starts moving, and during the B section we get to another room, and then when the da capo occurs, it's a completely different state of mind. And I think that's a way to be authentic, because that's what the da capo form means. That when you repeat the first part, the A part, it is not there just to showcase your coloratura abilities, but it really conveys a different state of mind of the character. And the revolve many times gives us the opportunity to find a visual way to convey this change of mind.
So the house, the revolving house, as Booth political invading the domestic, and as a certain kind of a metaphor or a metonym for the mind, right?
Yeah.
The different recesses of the mind, the nightmares, the illusions of Flavio, of the other characters. I sing an aria in which it's basically a nightmare.
Mhm.
I'm imagining what Rodelinda's doing.
Yeah, I mean, there's something else. Since the house has 2 floors, we can always picture 2 scenes at the same time. So let's say downstairs in the big dining room, someone is singing an aria, and in the same time we see Rodelinda, who's in her bedroom on the upper floor, and we can create a relation between the aria that is sung downstairs and her presence upstairs.
So
parallel action,
parallel action, and parallel perhaps states of mind.
Yeah.
And as you said, it is in some way keeping with this form that you find, that rhythm you find throughout the opera. Konrad, it's been fascinating talking to you. I don't want to take up any more of your time. It's been a wonderful talk. For those of our listeners who would like to see a bit of this production, it is available on DVD. Is it available online? I think it might be. This is a Claus Guth production conducted by Ivor Bolton in 2017. It's the Teatro Royal production. If you're interested in seeing more of it, of course, please do go to the Oper Frankfurt website, where you will see Claus Guth also talking about the production, and you'll see some pictures and some short videos to give you an idea of what we're talking about. And do go ahead and just listen to this wonderful opera. It's one of Handel's best, if not his
Absolutely,
best. It's an
yes.
absolute masterpiece, and just has such great dramatic flow to it. It's just been a pleasure coming back to it again here in Frankfurt. Konrad, on behalf of our listeners, on behalf of Newcastle University, I'd like to thank you very much for speaking with us today.
It was my pleasure, and I guess you have to go to your dressing room and get ready for tonight's performance.
I do. I have about an hour. I better get into makeup. With that, I will say goodbye to everyone, and thanks for tuning in.
Looking forward to hearing and seeing you on stage tonight.
Thank you again, Konrad.